And the context in which I wrote this paper is that recently there's been a lot of interest in the epistemic roles of visual attention for warranting basic visual beliefs. So, that seemed to be an interesting topic to me. But I found that the discussion, featuring people like John Campbell, Imogen Dickey, I never know how to pronounce her first name, Imogen, there you go, thanks. Susanna Siegel and Nico Sillins has revolved mostly around whether a demonstrative reference to bodies and visually based belief requires visual attention. So it was rather narrowly focused, I found. And I thought that the epistemic role of visual attention in perceptual warrant is presumably richer and warrants a more extensive scrutiny than this focus of the discussion suggests. So the idea was to, come up with something new on the epistemic roles of visual attention. And in this talk, my main point is going to be that I think that epistemologists have overlooked the central role that attention plays. Whenever I say attention, I mean visual attention, just in case people get confused. That attention plays in generating transsaccadic vision. So what I'm going to try and do today in this talk is, first of all, describe this role, the role of visual attention in transsaccadic vision, and second, argue that we cannot fully explain our warrant for many basic visual perceptual beliefs without appealing to visual attention's role in transsaccadic vision. And so I'm going to be mostly talking about psychology stuff, right? Then there's also going to be some epistemology that I'm going to keep at a minimum because, after all, we're mostly interested in the psychology of visual perception. Now, the kind of case, the example that I'm going to be coming back to over and over again is what I'm going to call the complex motion event. And the one example that I'm going to be referring to much of the time is the following. Suppose you see a cube. You see a cube that's rotating around its own axis, and that rapidly moves from your far left to your far right. Right? You see the cube as performing one coherent motion. Right? You see the cube is rotating and moving from the left to the right. Your visual system generates this perception from information gathered across several saccades, or eye movements, and shifts of attention. When that is happening, then your perception is a transsaccadic perception. It's an instance of transsaccadic vision. And I'm not very good at computers, but so I cribbed that from the internet. I would give an illustration. So something like this, right? You got the cube, take any one of these lines, you got the cube moving from the left to the right and rotating around its own axis. Okay? Now, here's the argument that I'm going to try to convince you of. The first premise is that many basic visual perceptual beliefs are formed on the basis of transsaccadic visual perceptions, right? So if you think that there's such a thing as basic visual beliefs, right, then if there's such a thing as transsaccadic vision, you should be prepared to accept that we can directly form beliefs on the basis of those percepts. Second, many transsaccadic visual perceptions require deploying visual attention in certain ways, right? So in order for you to have those percepts, the idea is, you have to shift attention in certain ways. So third, the formation of many basic visual perceptual beliefs requires deploying visual attention in certain ways. But then fourth, and this is where epistemology comes in, if the formation of many basic visual perceptual beliefs requires deploying attention in certain ways, then I'll argue we cannot fully explain the warrant for these visual perceptual beliefs without appealing to deployments of visual attention and forming transsaccadic visual perceptions. And that's a mouthful. Mm-hmm. And the basic idea is, if that's how we form those visual perceptions, by shifting attention, then we're going to have to say something about visual attention if you want to explain why we are warranted in beliefs based on those percepts. So that then 5 would follow that we cannot fully explain the warrant for transsaccadic visual perceptual beliefs without appealing to deployments of visual attention and forming transsaccadic visual percepts, right? And that would give us one role of visual attention in basic perceptual belief. At any rate, that's the argument. Now, what I'm going to do is the talk is structured in the following way. I'm going to first try and say something about why we should agree that there's such a thing as transsaccadic vision. Then I'm going to say something about why visual attention is needed for having that kind of vision. And then I'm going to say a little bit about why or how that figures into accounts of our warrant for beliefs based on those percepts. All right, so first I'm going to talk about transsaccadic vision. Now, here's what's going on in the complex motion event that I introduced earlier. In the complex motion event, the visual system integrates visual information from different fixations into one single transsaccadic percept. And again, what happens is a cube appears to your far left, exhibiting some specific orientation in three-dimensional space, moving at a certain speed. During the first fixation, your visual system takes in and processes information about the cube's shape, location, its three-dimensional orientation, and the direction and speed of its motion. Then the cube keeps moving, and it moves to your far right, rotating in the third dimension by a certain angle. You shift your eyes and attention to the cube's new location. During the second fixation, your visual system updates information about the object's shape, location, orientation, direction, and speed. Now, a transsaccadic memory underlies the generation of that percept. The transsaccadic memory maintains information from the first fixation for integration with information from the second fixation. Information from the two fixations integrates so as to generate a single coherent percept as of the cube's motion and rotation, namely the transsaccadic perception as of the complex motion. And as you can imagine, many of our perceptions are transsaccadic in this way. Right? There's many instances of us perceiving motion events, motion in the environment. Also, we can have detailed perceptions of objects that integrates information across several saccades, or, for example, perceptions as of complicated spatial relations, such as whether something is within a contour or outside a contour. So there's a lot of transsaccadic vision going on all the time.
Just to get clear about how it's supposed to work. So if you move from this world to this world, I'm going to get this movement, and alongside of this movement, I have this I'm making these saccades, and you call a fixation every time the foveation of these saccades coincide with the object that I'm tracking. Is this, I'm understanding?
Well, fixation is whenever you saccade from one position to the next. So whenever your fovea rests in a certain position, that's a fixation.
And then as you move from left to right, am I all the time fixating on you, or I'm also fixating on? So you move in, I don't know, 10 seconds?
Could be either. I mean, so no, I'm talking about a case, where you actually manage to fixate in the right places, so as for you to generate, a detailed motion. And let me just say one more thing. Of course, if I'm walking from here to the other side of the room, presumably that's too long for us to think there's one percept. But that's an empirical question, I think. So I'm thinking more rapid stuff, right? Yeah. And how long exactly those percepts are, I think that's an interesting empirical issue. Okay.
I mean, if the cube or yourself is moving in a constant, uniform movement, smooth from one side to the other, then normally you don't have saccades. It's like a pursuit movement. Mm-hmm. Just fix on the target and then just keep a smooth movement of your eye all the way to the right.
Yeah. So
my question is, what the transsaccadic movement, I think, would correspond more to an object that moves in a syncopated way, or you bring your eyes, your sight away from the object and then onto the object again. But are you talking about a continuous fixation of the object all along the way?
Well, you're talking about transsaccadic percepts, so I'm talking about cases which of course also are quite frequent, where you integrate information across saccades, and then that information in this case is about a motion event.
Okay.
Right? But of course I also, I don't want to deny that we also can like smoothly pursue the movement of a cube. Right?
Yeah, it's just two different kinds of
it's different ways of
yeah.
doing it. And I'm somewhat hopeful, although not aware of empirical research on, I'm somewhat hopeful that what I'm going to say about transsaccadic vision is going to transfer to smooth pursuit cases. But I just don't know the empirical research, and I would be thrilled if you had it.
Yeah, no, but the cube is a smooth pursuit movement, right? The cube.
In this case, no. I'm just stipulating. So I get to stipulate what the case is supposed to look like, right?
Oh.
I'm stipulating you're not actually pursuing your saccade.
Oh, okay.
More questions about the case? I mean, it's going to be,
It's restricted to one object.
in this case, yeah.
Yeah, but it could, with no problem, to how you integrate saccades if you have more than one object.
Presumably, I don't want to commit to it. It's a question of, you're going to see, I'm going to say a little more about what the memories are that underlie the integration. So, and then at some point, we're going to run out of memory space if there's too much stuff to keep track of.
But just in principle, if you can include two objects.
Yeah,
or something.
I would think so, yeah. Anything else? All right, so I'm saying there's a lot of transsaccadic vision going on all the time. And the complex motion event is just one illustration of that. Now, a lot is going to hinge on whether I can convince you that there is such a thing as transsaccadic vision. I think this is intuitively very plausible if you just reflect on your own experience. I mean, like it continues a visual scene, but of course, especially if anybody who's followed the philosophical literature on perception and visual consciousness, it's going to be a little more careful. So I'm going to do more to support my claim that there is such a thing as transsaccadic vision. So if you just reflect upon the following two facts, to which vision researchers also appeal, that should further support your conviction that there's such a thing as transsaccadic vision. So first of all, it performs saccades 3 to 5 times per second, and the visual system takes in visual information only during fixations. Right? The fixations last only a fraction of a second, but nevertheless we have a visual experience as of, or that is uninterrupted, coherent, and smoothly integrated. Right? We don't perceive snapshots, right? Where there's like a little break in between when we're saccading. So that should make it seem plausible there's such a thing as transsaccadic vision. Second, if the visual system did not maintain and integrate visual information across saccades, then we would have to reperceive the entire visual scene for every saccade, right? If there's no maintenance of information in transsaccadic memory, you would have to get all the information from scratch again whenever you fixate. And that seems to be utterly ineffective. It would take a lot of resources to do that. But there's also more direct empirical support for my claim on the claim that the visual system maintains and integrates information across saccades in the way that I sketched earlier. And I'm just going to illustrate that research by telling you a little more about a study by Fracasio, Karamazza, and Melcher in 2010. Also has a title, but I don't have it here. So the experiment was that they asked subjects to fixate attention on a cross. When the subjects were ready, the first stimulus appeared on the screen for 400 milliseconds. The stimulus could be a T-bar. I'm going to show you the stimulus in a second. A Necker cube, a single dot, or a square, or a random dot pattern. Next appeared a variable blank that was presented for between 105 and 400 milliseconds. And then finally, a second stimulus appeared on the screen. For the T-bar and the Necker cube, which are the more interesting ones for us, the second stimulus consisted in the translation or rotation of the first shape, right? So like a movement of that first shape. This is what those guys look like. Here's the Necker cube that gets longer. Here's another cube where it flips over. The T-bar and the same thought that moves from the bottom to the top. All right, so now the important thing, the experiment featured two crucial conditions. In a no-saccade condition, the subjects maintained fixation on the fixation cross throughout the trial, right? And you have the two displays where the thing flipped over or moved. In the saccade condition, the fixation point was displaced during the trial by 10 degrees. The subject had to perform a saccade approximately 300 milliseconds into the first stimulus, while that first stimulus was still visible, right? And with saccade, and the second the display would appear. While the displays changed, so while people were presented with an apparent motion, they had to perform a saccade, right? Here's an instance, presumably, of transsaccadic vision, if that's what we get. And indeed, subjects had to indicate whether they had two distinct percepts corresponding to the first and second stimulus, or whether they had a coherent percept as of a motion event. And for both the no-saccade and the saccade condition, subjects consistently reported a compelling percept of object transformation. So that is, they saw a single coherent motion event in both cases, whether they saccaded or not. So that's evidence that people perceive have a percept as of transsaccadic motion and a transsaccadic motion event. But again, if you followed the discussion, you might still wonder, but is this really perception, right? Isn't this an effect that's somehow due to some cognitive processing, people like making some kind of really fast inference, thinking really quick about what's going on, and then reporting on the basis of what they're thinking as opposed to whatever visual perception they had, right? So the worry is maybe transsaccadic vision is not vision proper. And of course, that's a very tricky question. What is it to be vision proper? And I'm not going to offer a principled general answer to that. But there's a bunch of considerations that speak in favor of something being actually vision proper as opposed to cognition. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit now. So Fracasso and his colleagues provided evidence against the possibility that all that's going on is cognition as opposed to perception by showing that transsaccadic vision exhibits perceptual adaptation. Right? So in a perceptual adaptation, the visual system's sensitivity to a specific kind of stimulus first rises and then falls. For example, if the subject first looks at a pattern tilted leftward and makes at a horizontal pattern, then the horizontal pattern will seem tilted rightward, right? Because the visual system is no longer as sensitive and corrects for a leftward tilted stimulus. So it sees that if you see the horizontal stimulus, it's going to look as though it was tilted in the opposite direction. That is a widely accepted indicator of perception. We don't find this kind of effect for cognition. And in particular, it's a widely accepted indicator of perception of motion. So motion after effect is what we're looking for if we want to show that the visual system adapts to a motion stimulus. And this is just what Fracasso and his colleagues found. So they had, they confronted people, subjects with a motion stimulus, say a random dot pattern moving in a certain direction across the cards, that is. Then they next confronted subjects with a neutral motion stimulus where there was no direction in which the dots would move, and subjects reported, so if the initial adapter stimulus was moving up, right, subjects reported that the neutral stimulus, the dots were moving down. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we would be expecting if the visual system were to adapt to a motion stimulus across saccades. Right, so that's the first consideration in favor of thinking this is actually vision. This data converges with other data. So first of all, there's direct empirical evidence that Melcher and Morone have gathered that, first of all, we find activation, strongest activation in visual areas V1 through V5 underlying these instances of transsaccadic vision. And of course, activity in those areas is widely assumed to be, perceptual activity. Also, our best explanation in terms of remapping of receptive fields, which we can talk a little more about later if you feel like it, appeals to what's going on in these visual areas, right? So, yeah, further evidence that we're actually dealing with vision. Next, we find transsaccadic percepts and transsaccadic memory for sub-threshold stimuli and for stimuli that are of a basic visual nature, right? So for stimuli such as tilted gratings, sinusoidal luminance patterns, dynamic form patterns, and so on, which are typically stuff that the visual system is dealing with. And also, we find transsaccadic vision for stimuli that are integrated but cannot be reported, right? And that, as Morone and Melcher say, that implicates spatiotopic transsaccadic integration in relatively early stages of visual processing. So again, more evidence that we're actually dealing with a genuinely perceptual phenomenon. And finally, for whoever might think that, oh, surely the effect must be due to some kind of working memory alone, right? So surely this person might think this what I call transsaccadic vision is not purely perceptual because working memory is involved. Gervais and his colleagues used a change detection test to show that transsaccadic memory differs from visual working memory, and that it's much larger than the 4 items characteristic for working memory. It decays after 300 milliseconds, so much earlier than contents in visual working memory, and is fragile and easily overwritten, unlike visual working memory. It's actually, presumably, it's the same kind of memory that Ned Block, for those who went to class on Wednesday, calls fragile visual short-term memory. It's presumably the same kind of thing. Okay, so I think that overall we have reason to think we're dealing with genuine perception here. So transsaccadic vision is visual perception proper, and from now on I'm just going to assume that, right? Let me just add here that this part is mostly of interest to philosophers of psychology, and I don't think it's going to affect anything I say about epistemology later, just like as a warning. Okay. All right, so hopefully now I've convinced you that transsaccadic vision is actually vision proper, and that it exists, right? And it's a fairly pervasive phenomenon. What I still have to do is argue that attention plays a role in transsaccadic vision. And here it comes. So first of all, why must the visual system generate such visual perceptions across saccades? Why would that be so? Right? I think the answer is that has to do with the inherent limitations of the visual system. We've just learned about that earlier, right? So the visual system must integrate information across saccades because the high resolution foveas attends only a very small segment of the field of vision. Foveal and attended vision typically encompasses only twice your thumb's width when your arm is stretched out, right? So you go like this, right? It's twice the width of your thumb. That's what you see in a foveal and attended way, unless of course you covertly attend somewhere else, which complicates the situation a little bit. Let's just bracket that for So, you know, most vision is peripheral and non-attentive, or at least not foveally attentive. So here's an illustration of foveal vision here, and then, you know, everything else in your field of vision. But, you know, you see it, how much is not within foveal vision. All right, so now, why are saccades needed for transsaccadic vision? So, and I take this not just to be a matter of stipulation, so, you know, it might, you should hear, you know, okay, we have these rich visual perceptions. Why are saccades needed for that? Well, just think again about the complex motion event. When the cube appears at the far left of your visual field, let's just suppose it's at a distance great enough for you not to be able to recognize its precise shape and orientation without foveating the cube. And suppose that the location of the second fixation of your eyes is located at 40 degrees eccentricity relative to your first fixation, right? So when the cube performs its rapid motion from the left to the right, your visual system will not be capable of computing the cube's precise shape and orientation at the new location. But both pieces of information are needed for the visual system to reliably compute the precise way in which the cube rotated in 3D space while moving from the left to the right. Right? So these, you know, you just don't get enough information from the first fixation to reliably compute the transsaccadic percept, right? Which would involve information also about what happens over here. And that's why you have to also fixate at the second location in order to gather that information and then to reliably form the transsaccadic percept. So the answer is that, you know, for many of our rich and detailed visual perceptions, we wouldn't be able to form those without integrating information across saccades. Because we just wouldn't have enough information to generate such a rich and detailed visual percept, unless we saccade. Okay? All right, but now you might go like, wait a second, saccades, yeah, psychologists talk as though they were attention. They call them overt attention, right? But psychologists are just confused about that. They shouldn't call them that. Really, the only real attention is covert attention. It's a matter of, you know, processing beyond whatever resolution you get at the fovea or at the retina. So I'm not going to get into an argument with someone who's worried about that. I'm just going to show you why covert attention is actually needed for transsaccadic vision, and not only overt attention. So why should we think that covert visual attention is needed for transsaccadic vision? Well, so first of all, visual attention, of course, improves visual acuity, right? So shifting covert attention to some location improves spatial resolution at that location and contributes to resolving visual detail for the perception of some complex motion, right? It just further boosts whatever advantage for resolution we get by just orienting the fovea to some stimulus. But second, and I think more importantly, in creatures like us at least, covert visual attention precedes saccades and is needed for saccades because visual attention selects the saccade's goal and guides the saccade to its goal. So there's a bunch of research by Cowler and others that maybe we can talk more about into the Q&A if you want to do that. Basically, they showed that whenever people saccaded to some specific location, they found that attention shifted there first, right? They found that perceptual identification of a stimulus there was improved, and that would be an indicator that visual attention went there first. And they also found that in dual task experiments where some of the attentional resources were diverted to some other task, actually the saccades became much less accurate, much slower, and therefore they found support for the idea that attention, picks the saccade goal and guides the saccade to its goal. And there's also computational and neuroscientific studies. How much more time do I have?
You have a bit less than 10 minutes.
Okay. So there's also computational and neuroscientific studies that converge with these behavioral experiments to the effect that the best pattern, the best computational models for explaining how attention shifts also best explain saccades and vice versa. And then it seems like the same neural mechanisms underlie both saccades and visual attention shifts. So to be sure, right, no one is denying that you can shift covert attention without saccading. Right? The idea is rather that you can't saccade without shifting visual attention.
Excuse me, is this eye movement and saccades exhibit certain pattern? Is that for attention?
Attention, yeah.
And
That's a mistake.
Oh.
Should be attention, yeah. I deleted the wrong word there. Okay, so again, I want to say, yes, it is. So what the question was, is visual attention needed for transsaccadic vision? Yes, it is, because there's strong empirical evidence that visual attention is required for integrating visual information across several saccades. All right, and now the philosophers of psychology can go to sleep and the epistemologists can wake up. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about epistemology. So the idea is, this is premise 4 of the main argument, and I'm going to return to it at the end. The idea is that if what I've said so far is true, then we have to invoke the role that visual attention plays in transsaccadic vision in order to fully explain our warrant for many basic visual perceptual beliefs. And now in the longer version of the paper that some people have suffered through, I show that for both externalist and internalist versions of warrant. And here, because I only have a little less than 10 minutes, I'm only going to argue that an externalist conception of warrant should acknowledge that. And well, my favorite conception, externalist conception of perceptual warrant is Tyler Burgess. He calls basic perceptual warrant entitlement. And that's the kind of epistemic warrant that accrues to our basic visual perceptual beliefs. And I'm not going to read. No one understands these quotes anyways. So there's a quote that basically supports what I'm going to say here in like just one sentence. So the basic idea is, in order to explain our basic visual perceptual warrant, our belief has to be directly based on a visual perception, like so far no surprise, but that perception must be the result of the exercise of a competence that functions essentially by its very nature to be reliably veridical. And so the function of the competence is to get stuff right, reliably, right, in the visual system's normal environment, which is just the environment in which the visual system evolved. Right? So the idea is, visual system, we can identify visual competencies as part of the visual system. These competencies evolved in the normal environment of the organism, such as this stuff here. Right? And the competency functions to get it right about certain properties or objects in the environment. And then the idea is that the function to get things reliably right in the normal environment helps us explain the reliability of the visual perceptual state that results from the exercise of the competence. And because that state is reliably veridical, right, true most of the time, accurate most of the time, it's a good thing to rely on in forming beliefs. It's the kind of thing that could generate warrant, epistemic warrant. Maybe it's going to get a little clearer once you see it in action, but so the idea is, well, now, in order to explain our warrant for visual perceptual beliefs that are based on transsaccadic vision, we have to specify a visual competence that functions to reliably generate vertical transsaccadic vision in the individual's normal environment. And so you have to say what the competence would be that underlies transsaccadic vision. And I think the following seems very plausible. So consider again, yet again, the complex motion event. The reliably veridical perception of the moving cube plausibly depends on visual information from both fixations, right? So in generating the perception as of the cube, the competence plausibly transitions from, so it takes as input information from the two fixations that yields as output, the motion percept. Or, the details I think don't really matter, but I have them here anyway. Fixation 1 gives you the cube at a certain position, at a certain time, a certain orientation, moving at a certain speed, in a certain direction. And fixation 2, well, the updated information is right over here. And then from those two, the competence moves to outputting the transsaccadic percept. The idea is fairly simple, right? And of course, you need a competence to see whatever is there at fixation 1. You need a competence to see what's at fixation 2. You need a competence to go from those two to the transsaccadic perception. You need a reliable transsaccadic memory that stores the information that you need in order to compute the transsaccadic perception. So all this stuff, all these we might think of as component competencies for like the competence that we're interested in, namely the competence for generating transsaccadic perception. And then vision scientists have come up with this idea that, well, since the stimuli at the retina underdetermine the percepts that we have, we need something like a formation law that governs the transition from whatever input we get at the retina to the resulting transsaccadic perception, where formation laws are just regularities in the visual system that somehow mirror regularities in the environment. So the idea would be, the one regularity would be if a cube is over here and moves at a certain direction and speed, and then like shortly later it's over there, right? So typically that means the cube moved from here to there, right? And the idea would be that the formation law is a result of the organism's interactions with the environment to the effect that the visual system picked up on that regularity and therefore can reliably form veridical perceptions of this type of event. All right, so the idea is, well, this is the kind of competence that would have to underlie the transsaccadic percept. And now we still want to hear a little more about why visual attention plays a role in explaining our warrant. And well, there's two things we should say. The first is that in many circumstances, the acuity of visual perception without visual attention would not be sufficient to generate reliably veridical percepts like fixation 1, fixation 2. Right? So the idea is, if you only get like very approximate, imprecise information about, say, the orientation, the location, speed, and so on of the cube at those two locations during the two fixations. So if your information is imprecise, then you couldn't reliably transition from that imprecise, approximate information to the precise information that's contained in the transsaccadic perception, right? So the way I set it up, right, the idea is that the transsaccadic percept tells you, or gives you precise information about orientation, direction, speed, and so on of the cube. And if the input information were to be imprecise, approximate, then this state as an output would not be reliable. But second, and again, more importantly, of course, information from fixation 1, right, presumably wouldn't suffice to reliably generate a veridical perception of the whole motion event. And suppose you don't get the information from fixation 2, but only the information from fixation 1, right? Then if on that basis the visual system were to generate a percept as of the whole motion event, right, that would be like a jumping to a conclusion. Right? So the result would be utterly unreliable, presumably, because that's, of course, compatible with too many scenarios that do not involve the complex motion event. For example, where the cube just stops rotating, is diverted, or hits an obstacle. Right? So in order to explain the warrant for our transsaccadic visual perceptual beliefs, the competence must use information from both fixations. Right? And as I argued before, in order to get that information, at least for viewers like us, we need visual attention. So we must appeal to how visual attention shifts so as to generate the transsaccadic visual perception. I think we have reason to accept that in order to explain our entitlement from transsaccadic vision, at least externalists must appeal to the role of visual attention. Right? Visual attention forms part of the visual competence that functions by its very nature. That part I actually haven't argued for. Let's just assume that. To generate reliably vertical transsaccadic vision. All right. Conclusion. Well, let's have another look at the main argument. So I've argued that there's such a thing as basic, as transsaccadic percepts, transsaccadic vision, right? And we should accept that we can therefore also directly form beliefs on that basis. I've argued that transsaccadic vision requires deploying visual attention in certain ways. And I've shown how at least the externalist should appeal to the role of visual attention in explaining our warrant for those transsaccadic perceptual beliefs. So I think I've shown that we cannot fully explain the warrant for these visual perceptual beliefs without appealing to deployments of visual attention and forming transsaccadic vision, visual percepts, and that's what I promised at the beginning. So thanks for listening.
So let's do the same again with students first. You'll have to be honest because there are only a couple who know to be students.
Can you go back the slide before conclusion?
Where do you want me to go?
The slide before conclusion, like that. You say there that visual attention forms part of the visual competence that functions. My question is, the visual competence that you're talking about, it's exhaustible? Because I was thinking...
Is what?
Exhaustible, like it's the only things we have to do so we can claim that our visual system generates reliably vertical vision. What I think is this. Maybe I have like an impairedness of vision and I need some glasses to see correctly. And I lost my glasses, so I see the cube. I would say that even though that there is a transsaccadic vision, that I have attention, stuff like that, given that I don't have my glasses, I cannot form vertical perception. So I was thinking that maybe, my question is, we need more stuff, or only the ones that we were talking about?
Also, see, I could happily accept that we need more stuff because I'm only arguing that we need visual attention. That's the main point. So, yeah. I mean, even if you have like, so suppose you don't put on your glasses, right? And then you have like blurry transsaccadic percept. That would still be a transsaccadic percept, and to the extent, in order even to have the blurry one, you would need to saccade and shift attention.
But it wouldn't generate any vertical perception. Given that I don't have like the...
It might be, so remember James's work, it might be just, the content of the percept might be indeterminate or approximate, like more approximate, but still it might be true. And it might be reliable about whatever range it approximately represents. But the main point is, I'm arguing for necessity, that nothing else is needed.
Perhaps you can explain a little bit the notion of competence. I mean, what is it? Is it a mechanism? Is it related to the formation laws? Just a little bit, because I didn't understand.
I don't know. So clearly, what I specified here is it was a mechanism, right? I'm talking about mechanisms. I do think the way I introduce the competence here, I do think of it as having a function, right? And so an aim, I think that's what people sometimes think is really important for having competence in like the epistemological literature. I do believe it's subpersonal, so it's not a competence in the sense that, you know, it's not like a personal skill or something like that. Can I get away with that, or I need to say something more?
Okay.
No, but was there anything specific?
I was thinking whether there could be whether we could postulate these competences as something that could have neuronal mechanism behind or not.
Say again, I was paying.
Whether we could postulate these competences as something for which we could discover neuronal mechanism afterwards, or there
Oh yeah,
are other things.
no, I believe, yes, certainly, yeah. I mean, you might just do this whole thing in an a priori fashion, or armchair fashion, let's say. You might just go like, oh, look, turns out we're shifting it. You know? And then you might say, well, this is the kind of, basically what I did here towards the end was a little more armchair than what I did at the beginning. So, you know, you might surely end up postulating something like that kind of competence, just on the basis of reflection. Philosophical reflection, but you know, I'm giving you also some reason, some empirical reason for thinking that stuff actually is there.
I think we can first.
I have two small questions. One is clarificatory, and the other one is non-objection to an invitation to widen your notion of warrant. So the first one has to do with this idea of transsaccadic attention, and I want you to tell me a little bit more. So everything sounds pretty plausible to me, and I find it interesting. But then I want to see how this interact with some things I know of attention. So imagine that I'm fixing the idea of the things, you know. So you have these kind of mechanisms, whatever it is. I mean, we don't need to suppose that it's right. I just want to know how compatible is it with this idea with all the theories. So I through my things, then I got the object, and then I need attention in order to follow them. Now, if I need, in every time that I do a transsaccadic movement, I need to get back at the object, since then I need to throw in my things. And I'm not sure what I'm saying. I want you just to explain me a little bit how this notion of transsaccadic attention fits with the idea, with classical experiments of following objects and theories thereof.
Well, I'm inclined to throw back at you why do you think it doesn't? So I mean, one way of hearing your question is just similar to what we heard before about, you know, isn't there also the possibility of engaging in smooth object tracking, right? And so what do you want to say about that kind of case? And you know, and there I would say, well, again, I'm inclined to think that it's fairly similar, and I'm inclined to think that especially if you want to have a rich visual perception. So remember, like, okay, so I don't think that for any kind of perception of motion, you need to saccade or even like deploy attention. I don't think that's so. I think you can see motion and maybe even track motion without, at least I want to be open to the possibility of doing that without attending, right? So the crucial thing is that in order to have a fairly rich motion percept, you know, that doesn't just involve like a dot moving, but also involves seeing the moving object as having certain features, right? So for that you need attention.
Maybe that.
And let me just finish being with and like Volition, I think, so Volition supports that kind of idea because, as far as I understand them, he thinks that in order to track objects, you don't need attention, or at least not allocate attention to each individual object, right? But then you don't know anything about the features of those objects, right? So in order to know something more about the objects, you're going to have to.
My question is more simple than that. Imagine that I'm just tracking four objects in this classical tracking experiment. So I'm going to be saccading all the time. So this is one of the cases which involve this transsaccadic question is, if I already have, so I have my things, right? And in order to get back, so I know what I can come back because I have one of those fingers of instantiation. So to one of these objects, and then with this transsaccadic attention, right? What's the role that transsaccadic attention plays? So in order to get back, I need attention. So the idea was, so I make a saccade to this object, and I saccade to this object. What is the mechanism that guides the saccade from this object to this object is transsaccadic attention. But I already have the things. This would be.
No, but the fence cases, the pollution cases are cases of smooth object tracking, where there's no saccade.
Okay, then don't I need to saccade in order to follow the 4 objects?
No.
Really?
I mean, that's what smooth object tracking is. It's that you don't have to be just like following red, right?
So, but I have 4 objects, and if they are outside my, maybe you're completely right. So I have no idea. I don't know what saccades, what's going on with saccades. But I assume that if 2 objects are in different positions, I would expect, so outside my phobia, I would expect, this is just a priori reflection of the worst kind, that my eyes will saccade. And if that happens, what would you say? Or if you have evidence that that doesn't happen, then it's fine.
Well, no, I mean, so there's probably people in the room who know more about the volition object tracking paradigms. I thought that in those cases, we don't deal with saccades, but with smooth object tracking, which is a different kind, entirely different kind of moving. Yeah.
So just a clarificatory thing. I think it may be that you're calling a saccade any movement of the eye, and you're calling a saccade only certain movements of the eye, right? So if you follow an object with your eye, that's not a saccade in this.
Exactly. So that's why I'm involving more than one object. So because I have to go there like scanning. So and that's a saccade. I'm leaving aside micro saccades and following. So I'm having saccades is.
Can you repeat what you said?
In fact, what I said, I think, is not a good diagnosis.
For me, yes.
I was suggesting that Miguel was calling any eye movement a saccade, and Denis clearly is not calling any eye movement a saccade. But it turns out that Miguel was not calling any eye movement a saccade.
I'm sorry, what is a saccade?
So a saccade is like more like a ballistic movement of the eye. So you fixate somewhere and then you shoot your eye to the next position, so to speak, right? Whereas like in smooth pursuit, suppose like a ball is moving, a smooth trajectory, and your eye actually is following it smoothly, just the way it moves, right?
That's why I think your example was kind of probably not the best, the moving cube, because it's more like a smooth tracking movement.
Yeah, well, I used that one because, this is empirical research that so nicely fits the purpose, and they're talking about just like fairly smooth movement. Although, of course, not in all cases where something moves smoothly, that your eyes have to move smoothly, right? If the thing moves like this, right, either your eyes could either move this way, right, or they could like saccade this way, right? And it's the latter case that may be somewhat confusing when I'm talking about.
So I think Miguel said he had another question, but Juan, you had a question as well.
Yeah.
So you go first.
Thank you. Well, actually, I think I understood and went along with you on the first half of your talk, and I agree with what you presented, I don't think you need to argue that much, about Transsaccadic Vision, because I think rather clear to me that it is the case. But toward the end, I'm intrigued by the way you use the notion of covert attention. Because it seems to me, you were saying that covert attention somehow precedes saccades and dictate or guide the eye direction of fixation. And from what I said before, I would say that it's more like the exception, but you're saying it's more like the rule. You can certainly dissociate, eye fixation, direction, and attentional fixation. But from what you say, it seems to be the opposite. Like it's supposed to be like the rule, like attention guides saccadic movement. And it seems to me, but this is just a suggestion, that what you call covert attention could be rephrased and call it a bottom-up attention, as opposed to top-down. Like overt attention would be more like top-down attention, dictated by like the subject's interests or whatever that comes from the subject. Whereas covert, in that sense, is more like elicited by the stimuli from the environment. Because otherwise, how could you explain, where the eye is going to move to, if it doesn't already know, what's there, interesting, What I'm saying is that if covert attention has a role in guiding saccades, it would be more as the case we were talking earlier on, as you get your attention grabbed, by something, at subliminal, subconscious level, and then your eye focuses and fixates the target, and then you can identify it, for instance. So along those lines, top-down and bottom-up versus covert.
So, I told myself not to be thinking in those terms, and maybe, we've learned that reflection on our own mental states is not super reliable. So the way, I think in the experiments upon which I base my claim that covert attention is needed to shift to saccade, I think people tend to think of covert attention, or tend to be a sign of covert attention, a mark of covert attention, a boost in processing, right? A boost in neural activation, and there's different types of boost, different types of ways in which activation might be boosted, or like there might be better filtering away of irrelevant stuff, right? But at any rate, a change in neural activity, right? As opposed to, so that would be covert attention. It has something to do with processing, right? As opposed to just like anatomical features of the retina, which, that would be a mark of overt attention, I take it, right? So just the fovea is like an anatomical thing, right? And I think the idea is that in either endogenous or exogenous attention, we find an increase of activity before the eye gets to where it's going to go. So that that kind of observation just basically grounds the claim that covert attention shifts to the saccade goal before the eyes, before the fovea reaches the saccade goal. So that's how I was thinking about this, distinguishing those two terms. And I think the experiments have been done for both exogenous and endogenous attention.
In the experiments, I don't know if you're aware of the experiments of Yarbus in the 60s.
Yeah.
If I remember well, you have different saccadic movement, for women and for men, and that would have to do, with the nature of the stimuli in the scene. So you would call that exogenous guided attention. I mean, the nature of the
Deep waters.
the stimuli.
I think, and it also depends really on what kinds of cases we're looking at, but I think psychologists call those cases of endogenously guided attention, because it's something like preferences, expectations, long-term memory that, influences what appears to be salient to, say, men or women. So, there's reason to call that stuff endogenous shifts in attention. And of course, Yarbus didn't have the machinery of looking at neural activity.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Is there someone else?
No, go on.
So maybe I got a little lost, but could you say that these formation laws guide the integration of information in Transsaccadic Vision?
Yeah, govern, I would say, but whatever.
Right. I wouldn't. I just want to know if I.
Oh yeah, so no, sorry, okay, sorry, I didn't mean to be that brief. I thought this was just like the beginning of the question. No, so yeah, the idea would be that, so like the case that everybody's talking about, right, is that, oh, well, look, the visual system detects edges, right, and uses that to compute objects or shapes. So now, how do we get from the underdetermined retinal information, which is just like, patterns of firing on the retina, which doesn't seem to be saying anything about edges or objects or anything like that. How do we get from that to a representation as of an edge or as of a shape or an object? And the idea is, well, look, the visual system has interacted with the actual environment so many times that over millions and millions of years, it's developed this competence or ability or mechanism, whatever you want to call it, that's governed by a kind of law. And the law says, well, if you have, say, a luminance contour on the retina, a certain pattern of firing on the retina, then say there's an edge there. Right? So that's the formation law. Go from this pattern of firing to this visual representation. And the idea is that we get something like that also in the case of Transsaccadic Vision. Right? Go from these two inputs to there's a cube moving from here to there. So you're absolutely right.
Miguel, did you have a second question?
It's just a minor point regarding Warrant. So the notion of
You're again
Warrant-
bashing me for something that Bert said.
No. I'm just inviting you to open the notion of Warrant, or tell me what I'm wrong. So the idea is that something is Warrant. It has to be reliable, veridical. I have to write a sentence here that I don't understand now. So
Do you want to go back?
reliable, veridical visual system.
That's the beauty of it. So this is my short version.
So-
This is the long version.
The idea is that we have a competence that must function by its very nature to be reliably veridical in the visual system normal environment. So imagine, and the problem, one problem I think, but maybe it's because I'm trying to do epistemology when I shouldn't, is the case of false beliefs. So under certain circumstances, it's very good for me to form the belief that the wolf is coming to hit me whenever I see a shadow. And it seems that I'm entitled to form that belief in spite of the fact that 90% of the time when a shadow appears, it's not a wolf. And it's enough that one time the wolf comes because I will be eaten, and that's bad for me.
Burgess' case is the rabbit and the hawk, I think. Is that what you have in mind?
That's Millikan's.
It's Millikan, so.
Oh, there you go. So see, I don't
So
read
the
it.
case of false beliefs is discussed always in the
yeah.
that's a case that I wanted to present. So
Yeah.
So you normally have your visual representation. The idea is that your visual representation do not need to be veridical most of the time.
Yeah.
And that's so. And one question is whether I would be warranted to believe that there is a wolf coming. I'd say what to say, but so and more importantly, so why don't you try just to open considering these cases? How is it that this notion? It doesn't seem to be a notion which is so central to making your point. I mean, maybe you just use, I need to take one, and this one is okay.
Also, I'm just gonna be flat-footed and put my cards on the table. I'm just gonna tell you why I like his account so much. Right? And I'm not gonna do much to argue in favor of it. I think. So I don't understand what the conception of epistemic warrant would be if it doesn't establish some kind of close connection to truth. I just don't get it. I like all this pragmatic ways of spelling out epistemic entitlement. I just stare at you with my mouth open. So yeah, I want, and reliable verticality is just, for me, that's a primitive truth connection, right? And I also find plausible for different reasons that the reliability of a state or a process can't be brute, right? which is something that a traditional reliabilist might be committed to. So I think, you know, we should have something like a competence that has a certain maybe essential function, right? And that's why I like this part especially. But the part that you're worried about, it's really just that I don't get, you know, why we should talk about epistemic warrant if there's not that truth connection. So in the case of the wolf, if I understood the case right, I would say, well, maybe you're entitled to form the belief, because it's certainly very useful to run away and not be eaten. But it's not an epistemic entitlement.
So you're not justifying that.
So you don't have an epistemic justification. Yeah. Because, you know, it's whatever the justification is, seems to be pragmatic without being able to fully spell out what that is, right? But it's not, you know, we don't have a truth connection. That's the idea.
Well, it's just the same point. I mean, just a follow-up, you know, because it seems to me that you don't really need a notion of verticality. I mean, reliability, I think, would suffice, it seems to me.
What would suffice? Sorry, reliability.
Reliability, right.
Also, but reliability,
In
the
terms
way I
of,
understand this is a matter of verticality. So when I talk about reliability, I mean getting it right most of the time.
right, but I mean, since what you said, you know, I get more your point, you know, you're trying to connect with truth, conditions, or
Yeah.
truth in general. But most of what you said is really low-level vision. And there's a tension, I mean, also given my previous talk, you know, trying to, you know, bring some conceptual logistic, you know, resources down to the low level, you know, and they're trying to sort of sneak, you know,
Yeah.
high level, you know, or concepts or beliefs or whatever down there, you know. Whereas I think you don't.
I think so. I think there's a commitment in the way I'm thinking about things that I haven't made explicit, and that, you know, you give me an opportunity to talk a little bit about. So I think that there's such a thing as perceptual representation, where perceptual or visual representation is not belief, it's not propositional, it's not conceptual, but nevertheless has truth conditions and has aboutness. You know, I think even though we're dealing with like low-level vision, and of course at some point maybe there's a cutoff, right? But even though we're dealing with low-level vision, I think there's truth conditions or accuracy conditions that we can attribute to visual states.
So what about other animals? Same?
Even in those, yeah. I think that's
Ants and
So I'm just shamelessly relying on Tyler Burge's conception of perception, where on this conception, as soon as you have a perceptual constancy, so as soon as your visual system picks out some distal property, such as having a certain shape, across wide variations of proximal stimuli, we have reason to think that your visual system attributes that shape to something. And that shape could go wrong, right? You might misperceive. So we have something like a truth or verticality or accuracy condition in those cases. And we have those perceptual constancies also in spiders and ants. Right? There's empirical evidence of those animals that we have the constancies.
well, that's one way of interpreting it. But as I was saying, in the case of a robot, you know, you also have the same capacity, you know, to connect reliably, you know, distal and proximal stimuli. But you don't need to bring in the notion of verticality or belief or content. Or
I don't think that I don't think Burge thinks that it's, you know. So one question is, how exactly do we have to think about what a perceptual constancy is? And another question is whether it's sufficient to engage in something like perceptual constancy. And, you know, one way of going might be to say, well, robots have something resembling a perceptual constancy, but that doesn't mean they have a mind. But, you know, I mean, I see those are tricky issues, and I think you're right too.
it just seems to me that you could pretty much say the same, you know, without committing yourself to this more like higher level of extended notions, you know, to explain these low level functions.
Well, since later I want to talk about like, well, I suppose, well, since I want to talk about the reliability, you know, the epistemically relevant reliability of a visual state, right? I get it doesn't commit me to talking about visual representations, but it suggests it. But, you know, Point taken.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dennis.